Hi, my name is Mags Chowcraft Islam. I'm a fourth year PhD student in scriptwriting, and my paper is about performing nationhood and the rhetorical construction of Britishness in parliamentary debates around the abolition of the slave trade. So before I begin, I just need to contextualise my arguments a little by digging down into the reasons for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself in Britain. Although since literally thousands of volumes have been written on this, I won't pretend to give anything but the most reductive summary. So traditionally, the roots of the parliamentary campaign have been traced to the contributions of two Christian movements, the Quakers and the Evangelicals, combined with the general Enlightenment belief in progress and benevolence. But mainstream academic thought now gives equal discursive prominence to the major part that many ordinary people played in applying pressure to political elites, as well as the important role of slave revolts, black abolitionists and the Haitian Revolution. That's without mentioning the economic arguments for the ending of the trade. So all of these arguments continue to evolve, but there is more or less a general consensus that the era of abolition was an important turning point in the development of man's moral perception. And what interests me here is Robin Blackburn's thesis that abolition was instrumental to the political and economic elite, both in terms of finding common cause with popular middle-class radicalism and in the early part of the century, unifying a nation at war with France. In a deep conservative political system, Blackburn writes, abolition of the slave trade became not so much the most urgent as the least controversial reform that could be undertaken. He emphasises that opposition to the slave trade was so successfully linked with British patriotism and national pride that a species of abolitionism became part of the reigning consensus. So the first part of this paper will explore this link between patriotism and abolition by means of a closer look at the slave trade debates in Parliament, both for and against abolition, with a brief exploration of the speeches of the Yorkshire MP William Wilberforce and an opponent of his called Sir William Young. So before we start with the two Williams, I want to take a quick look at the ideological nature of abolitionism itself. So central to anti-slavery argumentation was an appeal to the moral conscience of the British people. The emphasis was on the inhumanity and immorality of the slave trade and its incompatibility with Christianity, but also on the corrupting spirit of slavery, its polluting effect on the slaveholder, him or herself. So in this way, the character of the British people and their core values were increasingly seen to be deeply incompatible with the institution of slavery. Thus, Christopher L. Brown argues that many of the men and women who fought slavery were less motivated by their care for Africans than because they regretted slavery's impact on society, on the empire, on public morals, and on the collective sense of self. The era of British abolitionism, which coincided with the loss of the North American colony and the rise of capitalism, has also been represented as a period of active nation building. The debate over emancipation signified a profound step for the British people as a nation, initiating a review of their perceptions of themselves, as the historian Linda Colley argues that successful abolitionism became one of the vital underpinnings of British supremacy in the Victorian era, offering irrefutable proof that British power was founded on religion, on freedom, and on moral calibre, not just on a superior stock of armaments and capital. So anti-slavery advocates in Parliament called upon the enlightened spirit of Britons to act as leaders and show an example to the wider world. In an example, here's the Lord Chancellor in 1806 declaring that ending the slave trade was our duty to God, to our country, which was the morning star which enlightened Europe, and whose boast and glory was to grant liberty and life, and administer humanity and justice to all nations. However, both sides of the slavery argument were prepared to draw upon the good of the nation. Pro-slavery advocates claimed that Britain could not do without the slave trade. And this was not the only mutual point of contact between the two sides. As Christopher Brown emphasises, no one in Britain could campaign against colonial slavery without also confronting fundamental questions about the structure and purpose of empire. And both the abolitionists and those who fought against them shared a common belief in Britain's suitability to colonise other nations. This has led historian Catherine Hall to argue that the attachment to the idea of abolition as a mark of Britain's love of liberty and freedom is linked to a deep yet disavowed attachment in English culture to Britain's imperial power. This manifestation remains relevant in today's post-colonial society, in which the legacies of slavery and abolition endure in constructions of identity and public memory. The second part of this paper will examine the deployment of the narratives of abolition to construct so-called British values through cultural and creative products, as well as political speeches. So, in 1990, the historian Seymour Drescher undertook an empirical study which literally tallies up the number of times each reason for abolition is cited in the House of Commons or Lords. The resulting statistics show that moral considerations were twice as likely to be brought up as policy considerations. Interestingly, two of the subcategories that Drescher creates under moral considerations are labelled national guilt, shame, greed, and national honour, glory, example. So an example of the first category might be this quotation from the Solicitor General, talking in 1806, that a great source of revenue must be destroyed, be it so, at any expense, rather than the debts of England be paid with the blood of Africa. And an example of the second category might be this one. Let me congratulate Mr. Wilberforce upon bringing a measure which washes out this foul stain from the pure ermine of the national character. When added together, these two subcategories actually represent a number of citations almost as high as Drescher's top category under moral considerations, humanity, inhumanity. Their total number of citations outstrips both religion, Christianity, divine law, and justice, civilization. So this research exemplifies Christopher Brown's contention that moral capital was accrued by framing anti-slavery initiatives as an emblem of the national character. This came amid a growing perception in the country that its progress on both moral and secular matters would depend on how it comported itself on the issue of slavery. In 1807, the Bishop of Durham tells the Lords, "We are a people more favoured by heaven than any other nation has been from the commencement of time. But we should beware how we forfeit the protection of Providence by continual injustice, for if we do, we shall look in vain hereafter for the glories of the Nile and Trafalgar." So he's making an explicit link between the trade and the fate of the country, as well as its exploits overseas. And this language of moral rectitude, extending as it often did into a discussion of entitlement and control over others' freedoms, fed into the discourse of national identity. Nor was it confined to the anti-slavery benches. When it came to the representation of the true Briton, pro-slavery advocates were equally vocal. They invoked a number of qualities they considered to be British national characteristics, such as respect for private property, the commercial spirit of enterprise that built the country, and, surprising as it may seem to us now, the unrivalled good treatment of the enslaved by the British. The argument surrounding humanity was also deployed by the pro-slavery side, often linked with the idea of justice to one's fellow Englishmen, as in this example. Would the House say that the justice they would extend to the Africans, they would refuse to their own countrymen? Pro-slavery campaigners were quick to make comparisons between abolitionist concerns for enslaved people in the colonies and their lack of sympathy for the wage slaves of England. For his part, Wilberforce sets out his mission in his first proposal speech to the Commons in 1789. He says, "Wherever the sun shines, let us go round the world with him, diffusing our beneficence." These sentiments, according to Srividya Swaminathan, presaged the 19th century imperial mission by illustrating the rationale used to translate empire building into British beneficence. The same model was employed by the pro-slavery side. Sir William Young's response to one of Wilberforce's lengthy speeches, which was in April 1791, 2 years later, describes a scenario where Britain continues to participate in the slave trade as a wise arbitrator and benefactor. He says, "Instead of withdrawing from the trade, Great Britain should give example of new sentiments, of new policy, and awaken original principles of justice, and thus eventually legislate for the world and be indeed the imperial benefactress of mankind." So I want to have a look at his speech, this particular speech that he gives. It's notable for its various attempts to counter abolitionist argument. First of all, he distances himself from the support of the slave trade per se. He says it rests on principles repugnant to the temper of my mind. And this allows his opposition to abolition to be based on facts and figures rather than ideology. He builds his argument on the claim that the trade would exist anyway, and that the continuing British dominance of it ameliorated conditions for everyone involved. He begins by paying tribute to Wilberforce. Having yesterday listened with admiration to a speech of my honourable friend, in which knowledge and subtle argument and impassioned address to the heart comprised all that could be expected from the most learned, the most acute, and the most eloquent advocate of the cause which he had undertaken. Here he signals his indication to rival Wilberforce's famous rhetoric, whilst also doing his best to instil the impression that his opponent's arguments are based on passionate appeals to the heart. He uses language such as cool and temperate, time and reflection, truth and reason, ensuring that he sets sound judgment against emotional impulsiveness. Young's arguments are dominated by his contention that Britain's withdrawal will cause other countries to take over the trade and conduct it with less humanity. Such a concept is existentially impossible to think about today, but this stance relied upon tighter rules and better governance, and it was an important contributor to anti-abolitionist victories in Parliament. Young accordingly warns that the genuine motives of humanity require discrimination of circumstances, of objects, and of effects. He dismisses the benevolence professed by the opposition, portraying them as hypocrites and pro-slavery advocates as equally or more humanitarian than the abolitionists. Despite their manifest differences, Young and Wilberforce's convictions share certain common features. Among them is a sense of the superiority of the Briton over the African. Wilberforce assures Britons that Africans are not yet fit for the enjoyment of British freedom. He stresses the suitability of the freed slave to become part of a laborious and obedient peasantry. Nowhere does he entertain the idea of equality. This coherence in the argument of both camps towards the relationship with the colonised other reflects the fact that Britain in the 1790s was at a crossroads of understanding itself as a cohesive nation and its place in the world. The abolitionist challenge to the status quo forced parliamentarians to couch their arguments in terms of national prosperity and the public good, arguments that defined the nature and character of the Briton. The resulting image contained attributes lauded by both sides. In consequence, the abolition of the trade in 1807 enabled both winners and losers to celebrate the moral capital accrued by the nation as a whole. The outpouring of emotion that followed was directed as much towards the British people as the liberated Africans. Thomas Clarkson, whose 1808 history was the first official account of abolition, eulogised, "For while we rejoice to think that the sufferings of our fellow creatures have been thus relieved, we must rejoice equally to think that our own moral condition must have been improved by the change." Clarkson, according to Christopher Brown, established the teleological view of abolitionism as the verification of a nobility ostensibly essential to the English character. It provided the framework for anti-slavery history for a whole century, ensuring that British primacy in the war against barbarism reaffirmed the nation's place at the apex of refinement and virtue. This emerging imperial identity embraces a colonial discourse shaped by the beneficent form of colonisation ushered in by the slave trade debates, one which is founded on morality and Christianity rather than bondage and despair. The moral capital accrued by the post-abolition Briton was a resource that could serve a variety of purposes, and the moral virtues celebrated in both Wilberforce and Young's performative rhetoric contributed to the construction of national attributes or values that continue to bear down on perceptions of Britishness in the 21st century. For instance, David Cameron's 2014 article in the Daily Mail included a reminder that this is the country that helped fight fascism, topple communism, and abolish slavery. It seems politicians are far more willing to celebrate the abolition of slavery than to regret the 200 years in which Britain was the most successful slave trading nation in history. Public interest in Atlantic slavery and abolition was significantly augmented by the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007. This year marked a cultural explosion in abolition-related productions. Arguably, the dismantling of slavery can be unambiguously celebrated in a post-colonial society in which many previously lauded national events, historical achievements, and traditional attributes have become more complex and ambivalent. The 20th century saw the almost complete disintegration of empire, leading to a historiographic re-evaluation of the campaign against slavery in British public discourse. Historian Diana Paton speculates that the mass-scale reappearance of these narratives in the public domain also owes much to the workings of contemporary British politics. 200 years after 1807, she writes, the British government was again trying to persuade both the British population and the international community of Britain's moral virtue in the context of an unpopular war. As in the period of the Napoleonic Wars, civil liberties were sacrificed on grounds of national security needs. Paton is referring here to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. British Prime Minister Tony Blair wrote then that the anniversary of abolition was a chance for us all to deepen understanding of our heritage, celebrate the richness of our diversity, and increase our determination to shape the world with the values we share. This rhetoric reveals a political desire for the bicentenary to be seen in the popular imagination as a celebration of the victory of British historical virtue and as a template for the active propagation of British values. As Waterton et al. In their article Forgetting to Heal, Remembering the Abolition Act of 1807, assert, this amounts to a fending off of attributions of blame and guilt by the mobilization of collective memories that either justify or ignore negative aspects of a group's history. The slavery historian James Walvin cautiously welcomed the genuine groundswell of public interest in the bicentenary, as it appeared to him that there was a growing appreciation that the enslaved Atlantic was central not merely to the Americas or Africa, but to Britain itself. The notion that British public discourse in recent decades has incorporated more explicit linkages between slavery and metropolitan British life is disputed by Diana Paton, who maintains that white British self-congratulation and pride dominated the most visible responses to the bicentenary. She notes that in telling stories about slavery, it's all too easy for a teleological story of slavery into freedom to slip from the pages of history into museum galleries, school curricula, and political speeches. This also applies to creative cultural products, such as books and films. In 2007, the figure of Wilberforce was celebrated on multiple platforms with a gusto not seen since Victorian times. His biographer, William Hague, enthused, "In the dark, historical landscape of violence, treachery and hate, the life of Wilberforce stands out as a beacon of light, which the passing of 2 centuries has scarcely dimmed." It seems that Wilberforce has come to embody and symbolise what many Britons still see as the most virtuous pages of British history. Creative and historical representations echo this, such as the 2006 film Amazing Grace, a Wilberforce hagiography which bears out the extent to which the veteran campaigner is still venerated in this country. Waterton et al. Argue that such films adopt a schematic narrative template which promotes ideals of benevolence, heroism, togetherness and justice when assessing British involvement in ending the slave trade. The abstract storylines simplify or ignore conflicting interpretations of the past, reinforcing how individuals think and respond to history. The consequence is the creation of a blank spot in the cultural memory of Britain, as trauma and brutality are conveniently forgotten. They write, "Forgetfulness such as this significantly affects Britain's ability to reflect on both its past and its present. This is particularly apparent when considering the inheritance of residual racism and a raft of associated social and political problems, which are the legacies of Britain's preeminent role in the enslavement of African people." Over a decade after 2007, to a British public in the aftermath of the so-called Windrush scandal, discursive connections between empire, race and the establishment of British identity are inevitably more familiar. Catherine Hall notes that due to welcome changes in schools and universities, more scholarship produced, more materials made available, there's a sense that the story cannot any longer be told in quite the way it once was, and that the national narrative has shifted. It is true that in recent years some television programmes have appeared addressing the involvement and complicity of the British government, British people, British institutions, British businesses. However, while some emergent post-colonial narratives, such as the stories of slave resistance or black abolitionism, can be integrated with relative ease into a wider narrative that emphasises liberal humanitarianism, others that seek to emphasise the damage done by enslavement have proved much harder to present as public history. To conclude, the focus of cultural products appears to be relocating towards Britain's relationship with her colonies and the impacts of slaveholding on British soil. The 2019-2020 theatrical season, for example, proved particularly rich in plays featuring stories linked to formerly enslaved Anglo-Caribbeans and British slave owners. However, large-scale mainstream commercial productions and political discourses have yet to follow a similar path, and the enduring reputations of the abolitionists, alongside the rhetorical legacy of William Wilberforce, appear set to continue to exercise their steadfast grip upon the public imagination. Thank you.